Oh, look at that rooster go. I'll get him.
It's so fast.
Careful now.
We have to go. Now!
What's happening?
No time. Come on. This way.
How could you hide this from me?
I had no choice. Please understand.
What's going on here?
We heard shouting.
Everyone, listen. I have grave news. The situation is dire. We must act now. Our family's future is at stake.
Will you accept me?
In the restless heart of Lagos, inside the lively neighborhood of Aya, there lived a woman named Chama who believed her life was wrapped in quiet blessings and answered prayers, the kind of life many women prayed for at night. At 32, she had been married for 7 years to Aka, a hard-working construction contractor whose hands were rough from cement but gentle when they touched her face, and together they had built what looked like a beautiful story: 2 children, a 6-year-old boy named Ched who loved to run barefoot across the compound, and a 4-year-old girl named Amara whose laughter could brighten even the darkest mood. Their home was not a mansion, but it was comfortable, a modest 3-bedroom flat in a shared compound filled with everyday characters who made life colorful: Mama Gozi frying puff-puff at the gate, Brother Tund blasting loud music like he was hosting a daily concert, and an elderly couple who watched the world from plastic chairs under the mango tree. And next door lived a quiet, soft-spoken woman named Adisi, who had moved in 2 years earlier and always greeted Chama with a gentle smile and the words, "Good morning, my sister." Adisi appeared harmless, even kind, often bringing plates of rice or stew claiming she had cooked too much, sometimes offering to watch the children when Chama needed to rush to the market for her small online clothing business, and Chama, grateful for such neighborly warmth in a busy city like Lagos, often praised her kindness at the dinner table, telling Aka how lucky they were to have such a thoughtful neighbor. Yet every time she mentioned Adisi's name, Aka would simply nod without looking up, his eyes fixed on his plate as though the food demanded more attention than the conversation, and though this small detail flickered like a weak candle in the back of her mind, Chama dismissed it because love has a way of softening suspicion and turning silence into normalcy. Each morning, Aka kissed her forehead before leaving for work, promising to return early, and each evening he came back smelling of dust and hard labor, and Chama would serve his food warm, proud of being the supportive wife who kept her home peaceful. To her, marriage was teamwork, sacrifice, and loyalty, and she believed deeply that trust was the foundation that kept everything standing. She never imagined that the very walls protecting her family were hiding something dangerous, that the friendly wave from next door carried more weight than she understood, or that the woman she called "my sister" shared more than a fence with her. Life moved smoothly like a well-rehearsed play, predictable and comforting, until tiny unnoticed details began arranging themselves quietly in the background: the way Aka avoided eye contact when Adisi's name came up, the way Adisi's smiles sometimes lingered a second too long, the way certain mornings felt slightly off without reason. But Chama ignored these whispers of doubt because happiness, when it feels complete, convinces you that storms only happen in other people's stories. She believed she was the first and only wife, the chosen partner, the woman who stood beside her husband in white at their wedding ceremony surrounded by music and celebration, and she carried that confidence like a crown, unaware that destiny was already preparing to test the strength of her peace. In that crowded compound in Aya, where doors were close enough to hear arguments and laughter through thin walls, secrets were breathing quietly between houses, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves, and Chama, wrapped in trust and routine, had no idea that the greatest betrayal of her life was not far away in another city. It was living just one wall away, smiling at her every single morning. The first crack in Chama's perfect life did not come with thunder or shouting. It came softly, carried in the innocent voice of a child on a humid Thursday evening in Lagos, as she stood in her kitchen stirring a pot of beans while the aroma filled their modest flat in Aya. Her son Ched burst into the kitchen, breathless and wide-eyed, his small chest rising quickly as though he had just witnessed something extraordinary, and he announced with urgency that he had seen his father entering Auntie Adisi's house through the back door only moments earlier. Chama laughed at first, the way mothers laugh when children mix imagination with reality, and she told him gently that his father was still at work and would not return until evening, but the boy insisted, his voice trembling with certainty, repeating that he had called out, but his father did not answer. The spoon in Chama's hand froze midair, and for a brief second the kitchen felt smaller, the air thicker, yet she forced herself to dismiss the thought, convincing her racing heart that perhaps someone merely resembled Aka, because after all, Lagos was full of men who shared similar builds and faces. When Aka finally came home at his usual time, greeting the children with his familiar smile and asking for water as though nothing had happened, she casually asked if he had returned earlier that day, and he responded quickly with a sharp no, followed by an unnecessary question about why she would even think that, and though his tone was calm, something underneath it felt defensive, like a door being shut too fast. That night Chama lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing while her mind replayed her son's words over and over, and sleep avoided her like a secret avoiding exposure. 2 weeks passed with forced normalcy until another moment pierced her denial when her daughter Amara began singing a strange playful tune while folding small clothes in the bedroom, a melody about daddy buying sweets in another house where they sometimes ate together. And Chama's heart dropped so suddenly she felt dizzy. She called both children into the room and demanded gently but firmly to know where they had learned such a song, and after hesitation and visible fear, Ched confessed that Auntie Adisi had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and that sometimes when Chama sent them to deliver food or greet her, they played inside her house, and that the little boy looked exactly like him, so much that neighbors had even commented on the resemblance. The room seemed to spin as Chama processed the information because she had believed for 2 years that Adisi lived alone, a quiet woman with no husband and no children, and suddenly her carefully arranged assumptions began to crumble. When she confronted Aka later that evening about whether Adisi had children, he reacted not with explanation but irritation, his voice rising louder than she had ever heard in 7 years of marriage, accusing her of imagining nonsense and asking if she was trying to accuse him of something after all he did for the family, and that reaction frightened her more than any confession could have. In that moment she realized something crucial: innocence answers calmly, but guilt often shouts, and instead of arguing further, she chose silence, because she understood that truth reveals itself best when watched quietly. The next morning, long before dawn stretched across the compound, Chama woke at 5 o'clock and positioned herself near the window that faced the back of Adisi's house, her heartbeat steady but heavy, and at exactly 5:30 a.m., she saw what her son had tried to tell her. Aka slowly rose from their bed, dressed quietly, tiptoed out of their flat as though afraid of being heard, looked left and right across the compound like a thief avoiding witnesses, and then walked directly to Adisi's back door where he knocked softly before disappearing inside. Chama did not scream, she did not cry, she simply watched in frozen disbelief as 30 minutes later he returned the same way, slipped back into bed, and pretended to wake up at his normal time, stretching and greeting her as though he had just opened his eyes for the first time that morning. And in that silent observation her world shifted forever because the lie was no longer suspicion, it was a living reality she had witnessed with her own eyes. For 7 unbearable mornings in the crowded compound of Lagos, Chama stood behind her curtain before sunrise, watching her husband repeat the same secret ritual as though betrayal had become part of his daily routine. At exactly 5:30 a.m., Aka would rise quietly from their bed, careful not to wake her or the children, move with calculated silence across the tiled floor, step outside into the pale blue dawn, glance around like a man guarding a dangerous secret, and then walk straight to the back door of Adisi's house where a soft knock granted him immediate entry, and 30 minutes later he would return, slip back into bed, stretch theatrically at 6:30 a.m., and greet her with the same familiar smile that once made her feel safe. Each day Chama's chest tightened as though invisible fingers were squeezing her heart, yet she refused to confront him without undeniable proof because she understood that truth, when exposed publicly, carries more power than private accusations. On the 8th morning, unable to endure the slow torture of silent confirmation, she wrapped her cloth firmly around her waist, waited for him to sneak out as usual, and then followed him at a distance, her heartbeat pounding so loudly she feared the entire compound could hear it. She watched him disappear through Adisi's back entrance, and instead of approaching from behind, she marched directly to the front door and began pounding with a force that shattered the quiet of dawn, shouting Adisi's name with authority that carried across every house in the compound. Inside she heard scrambling footsteps, hurried whispers, the unmistakable sound of panic trying to rearrange itself, and when the door finally opened, Adisi stood there in a thin nightgown, her face pale, her hands trembling, her eyes wide like someone caught between denial and disaster. Without waiting for permission, Chama pushed past her and stepped into the living room, and what she saw froze time itself. There stood Aka wearing nothing but his boxer shorts, his confidence stripped away along with his dignity, and seated on the couch were 2 small children, a boy about 5 and a girl barely 3, staring in confusion at the unfolding chaos, and the boy's face mirrored her son's so perfectly that it felt like looking at a reflection in broken glass, same eyes, same nose, same stubborn chin. The silence in that room was heavier than wet cement until Chama's scream tore through the air like an alarm bell, echoing across the compound and dragging neighbors out of their homes in wrappers and slippers, confusion written across their faces as they rushed toward the sound. Mama Gozi arrived breathless. Brother Tund stepped out holding his phone ready to record. The elderly couple shuffled forward whispering prayers, and within moments a crowd had formed around the doorway witnessing a scene that looked like something from a dramatic African film but was painfully real. Chama pointed at her husband with shaking hands and demanded answers, her voice breaking between rage and disbelief, asking how long he had been living this double life, how long he had allowed her to smile at the very woman who shared his bed behind her back, and Aka attempted to pull her aside, begging to talk privately, but she refused because secrets had survived too long in darkness and she would not allow them to hide again. Adisi began crying, murmuring apologies that sounded hollow against the weight of betrayal, while the children clung to the couch in fear, unaware that their existence had just detonated a marriage. Chama felt humiliation burn hotter than anger as realization settled into her bones that the life she trusted had been divided by a wall thinner than she ever imagined. In that single explosive morning, surrounded by witnesses and truth too visible to deny, Chama understood that her marriage was no longer cracking quietly, it had shattered in broad daylight, and there was no gathering the pieces without cutting herself in the process. The compound in Lagos had never witnessed a morning like this, and as neighbors crowded the small living room in the heart of Aya, the air felt thick with judgment, shock, and anticipation while Chama stood in the center of it all demanding answers that could no longer hide behind silence. Aka, stripped not only of clothing but of dignity, tried to gather words that refused to form, yet under the weight of staring eyes and whispered prayers he finally confessed the truth that shattered what little hope remained. Adisi was not a mistress, not an affair, but his first wife, married to him 10 years ago in a quiet traditional ceremony in his village long before he ever met Chama. The crowd gasped as if rehearsed, and Chama felt her knees weaken because that confession did not merely reveal betrayal, it rewrote her entire identity. She had believed she was the first and only wife, the woman who wore white at a grand wedding filled with music and celebration, never imagining she was unknowingly stepping into a role already occupied. Aka explained in a trembling voice that he had left the village promising Adisi he would return after establishing himself in Lagos, promising to send for her once his finances improved, but instead he built a new life, fell in love again, and married Chama without ever dissolving his first marriage, maintaining both realities through lies and careful distance. For years he sent money to Adisi quietly, telling her to remain patient, until 2 years ago when he brought her to Lagos and rented the house next door under the excuse that he wanted all his children close, believing somehow he could balance 2 households separated by a thin wall without either woman discovering the truth. Chama listened in disbelief, her chest tightening as humiliation wrapped around her like chains, because this was no accident or misunderstanding, this was deliberate design. He had positioned her and his first wife side by side like pieces on a chessboard, confident that secrecy would protect him forever. When she turned to Adisi, searching for denial or regret, the other woman's trembling confession cut even deeper. She had known about Chama from the very beginning, she knew her husband had married again in Lagos, knew there was another woman living as wife, and yet she agreed to move next door believing she would eventually reclaim her rightful place as the true first wife. The cruelty of that arrangement stunned the compound into murmurs because this was not simply a man trapped between 2 loves, it was a calculated deception involving patience, strategy, and manipulation. Chama's voice shook as she asked why they would place her so close to the truth, why they would allow her to greet her rival every morning with genuine warmth, and Aka's answer was weak and selfish. He claimed he wanted unity, wanted his children to grow up together, wanted peace. But even the crowd knew those words were empty. Unity built on lies is merely chaos waiting for exposure. The realization that she had been living in a staged reality, smiling at the woman who shared her husband's past and present, crushed something inside her spirit, yet instead of collapsing, she straightened her shoulders and faced them both with a clarity that silenced the whispers around her. In that small living room filled with neighbors and shattered illusions, Chama understood that her marriage had not simply cracked, it had been constructed on hidden foundations from the very beginning, and now that the truth stood naked before everyone, there would be no returning to the comfort of ignorance. The confession of a hidden first marriage was devastating enough, but what followed inside that crowded house in Lagos pushed the betrayal into something darker, something almost evil. As Chama stood facing both her husband and the woman she once called sister and demanded to know what their true plan had been by placing 2 wives inside the same compound in Aya, and it was Adisi, trembling and unable to withstand the weight of watching eyes, who finally revealed the cruel strategy that had been unfolding quietly behind plates of shared food and friendly greetings. Through broken sobs she admitted that Aka had convinced her there was a way to remove Chama without scandal, without confrontation, without exposing his lies, a slow plan, subtle and patient, where Adisi would win Chama's trust completely, become her closest friend, and then begin mixing small traditional substances into the meals she occasionally brought over, not enough to kill but enough to weaken, irritate, exhaust, and destabilize her emotionally until she appeared constantly angry, sickly, and difficult, giving Aka the perfect excuse to claim his second wife had become unbearable and send her away peacefully. The crowd gasped in horror as the meaning settled into the room, and Chama felt the blood drain from her face because memories suddenly rearranged themselves with terrifying clarity, the unexplained fatigue that clung to her bones for weeks, the headaches that would not disappear, the sudden mood swings she blamed on stress, the strange bitterness she sometimes tasted in the food Adisi insisted she finish. She had thought she was simply overwhelmed by business and motherhood, never imagining that something invisible was being added slowly to her body under the disguise of kindness. When she asked quietly, her voice steady but colder than harmattan wind, whether the poisoning had truly happened, Adisi could not meet her eyes, and that silence screamed louder than any confession. The neighbors erupted with anger, some shouting prayers, others cursing Aka openly, calling him wicked for orchestrating such cruelty against the mother of his children, and yet in the center of the chaos Chama did something that shocked everyone. She became calm, frighteningly calm, the kind of calm that feels like the stillness before a violent storm. She looked at Aka with a gaze stripped of love and said he was not brave enough to tell the truth, not man enough to face the consequences of his own choices, choosing instead to hide behind herbs and manipulation like a coward afraid of honest conversation. And then she turned to Adisi and asked how a mother could agree to harm another mother for the sake of a man who had already proven he was capable of lying to both of them. Tears streamed down Adisi's face, but sympathy no longer lived in Chama's heart, the betrayal had burned it away completely. Instead of fighting physically or screaming further, she announced with chilling clarity that she would not compete for a man who treated marriage like a game of strategy, that she would not remain in a house where her food could no longer be trusted, and that she valued her peace more than any title of wife. Without waiting for their responses, she walked back to her flat, locked the door firmly, and called her elder brother, her voice no longer trembling but decisive, telling him simply to come immediately with a truck because she was leaving that day. Within hours, as neighbors watched in stunned silence, men began packing every item she owned, pots, plates, clothes, children's toys, as if rescuing valuables from a burning building, and Aka followed her around begging, apologizing, promising change, but his words bounced off her like rain against concrete because the moment he chose deceit over honesty, he had already lost her. By the time the afternoon sun hung high above the compound, Chama stood ready to step into a new life, her children beside her, and though pain still burned inside her chest, her dignity stood untouched, stronger than ever, because she had realized something powerful. It is better to walk away wounded than to stay where your soul is being poisoned slowly, spoon by spoon, under the disguise of love. By the time the sun began to sink over the restless skyline of Lagos, Chama had already made the decision that would redefine her life forever, and as the truck loaded with her belongings rolled slowly out of the compound in Aya, she did not look back at the man kneeling near the gate, crying and begging for forgiveness, because in her heart something irreversible had already shifted. Aka's voice cracked as he pleaded for another chance, promising change, swearing that he would send Adisi away and fix everything, but Chama understood that broken trust cannot be repaired with panic-driven promises, and she responded with a calmness that silenced him completely, reminding him that a man who chooses lies over honesty does not deserve loyalty in return. Within days she moved into her elder brother's home, where safety replaced fear and clarity replaced confusion, and she immediately filed for divorce, refusing to remain legally tied to a deception that had nearly destroyed her health and sanity. She also reported the attempted poisoning to the authorities, and medical tests later confirmed the presence of strange substances in her bloodstream, validating her worst fears and sealing Aka's humiliation in public record. News spread quickly through the neighborhood like wildfire during harmattan season. The man who kept two wives in the same compound, the man who plotted to weaken one woman to satisfy another, and respect for him evaporated almost overnight. Business partners distanced themselves. Clients withdrew contracts, and whispers followed him wherever he walked, because in communities where reputation is currency, betrayal is expensive. Adisi, unable to withstand the shame and the accusing stares, eventually returned to the village with her children, leaving behind a house filled with memories of exposed secrets, and Aka found himself alone in the very compound he once believed he controlled, abandoned by both wives, surrounded only by the echoes of his own greed. Meanwhile, Chama's journey toward healing was not instant but steady, like a flower forcing its way through cracked concrete. With the support of her family, she revived her online clothing business, working late nights with determination that replaced sorrow, channeling pain into productivity, and gradually financial independence restored a confidence that betrayal had shaken but never destroyed. Her children adjusted slowly, asking difficult questions that she answered with honesty softened by protection, teaching them that love should never require silence in the face of wrongdoing, and as months passed, laughter began returning to their home in small but meaningful doses. One evening, when Aka called again begging her to reconsider, claiming he had learned his lesson and missed his family, Chama laughed, not with bitterness but with freedom, and told him that some people are like counterfeit money. They look real, they feel convincing, but when tested under pressure, their falsehood becomes undeniable, and she thanked him for revealing his true character before she wasted a lifetime defending a lie. The story of what happened in that compound became a cautionary tale repeated by neighbors whenever conversations turned to marriage and secrets, a reminder that deception hidden behind friendly smiles will eventually knock loudly enough to wake everyone. Chama no longer defined herself as a victim but as a survivor, a woman who chose peace over pretense and dignity over drama, and though the scars of betrayal remained, they served as proof of her strength rather than symbols of her weakness. In choosing to walk away, she discovered something more valuable than the title of wife. She discovered herself, and in the end, while Aka sat alone counting the cost of his dishonesty, Chama stood taller than ever, living proof that peace of mind is worth more than any marriage built on lies, and that sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is close the door behind her and never open it again.